A 23-year-old software engineer just got his first real paycheck. Not a side hustle deposit, not a stipend, a salary, with benefits. He opens his banking app, stares at the number, and then drives to a Honda dealership. Not to browse, to buy. He already knows the trim level. He already knows the color. He walks past the showroom's feature wall, a wall draped with financing offers for vehicles that cost more than his parents' first mortgage, and he doesn't even slow down. His coworker, a 38-year-old, cannot understand this. The coworker remembers what it felt like to finally afford something that announced arrival. He bought a used BMW at 32 and felt his spine straighten when he pulled into the parking garage. He assumed everyone felt that pull. He assumed it was human nature. But this 23-year-old doesn't feel it. And that absence, that complete lack of appetite for the signal, is not indifference. It is a conclusion. To understand that conclusion, you have to go back to the specific world that built this person's brain. Gen Z, broadly defined as those born between 1997 and 2012, did not grow up in a world where the future felt stable. They were children when the 2008 financial crisis broke open something that had been quietly cracking for years. They were not old enough to lose jobs or mortgages, but they were old enough to absorb the atmosphere. Dinner conversations shifted. Parents who had projected confidence started projecting caution. Neighborhoods in cities like Detroit, Phoenix, and Las Vegas changed visibly. Houses sat empty. Yards went uncut. These were not abstract news stories. These were the streets Gen Z walked to school. Then came the years that followed, the slow, grinding recovery that never quite felt like recovery for many families. Gen Z watched adults rebuild using gig work, side income, and freelance contracts that offered no safety net. The concept of a stable career, a single employer, a pension, a reliable path, looked less like a plan and more like a story older people told about a country that no longer existed. And none of this was dramatic to Gen Z. It was simply the weather. This matters because of how the developing brain processes ambient uncertainty. When children grow up around chronic financial instability, even mild versions of it, even second-hand versions absorbed through parental stress, the brain begins to optimize for security over display. It learns to read risk differently. Luxury, to a brain shaped by scarcity signals, does not register as reward. It registers as exposure. Spending large amounts of money on things that depreciate immediately starts to feel not aspirational, but careless. This is not a moral position. It is a neurological adaptation. But the financial anxiety was only one layer. Gen Z also grew up in the first era in which social media was not a novelty, but infrastructure. By the time they were teenagers, platforms like YouTube had already shifted from entertainment into education. Channels built around personal finance, frugality, early retirement, and minimalist living had millions of subscribers. Not because these ideas were new, but because the algorithm surfaced them to exactly the right audience at exactly the right developmental moment. A 14-year-old in suburban Ohio, already carrying ambient anxiety about money, could stumble onto a video about compound interest and have the architecture of his entire future relationship with spending permanently altered before he turned 15. Previous generations received financial education from institutions or not at all. Gen Z received it from peers, from creators they trusted, from people who looked like them and spoke without corporate caution. The message was consistent. The car payment is the trap. The car payment is always the trap. And so when Gen Z enters the car market, they do not arrive as blank consumers, ready to be shaped by dealership lighting and leather smell. They arrive already shaped. They have already run the numbers. They already know what a 5-year loan on a $40,000 vehicle costs in total. They already know that a Honda Civic, maintained properly, can run past 200,000 miles. These are not revelations. These are foundational assumptions absorbed over years of content consumption during the most impressionable window of cognitive development. Here is what most observers misread. They look at Gen Z's car choices and see frugality. They frame it as budget limitation dressed up as preference. They assume that if these young people had more money, they would eventually migrate toward the luxury tier the way previous generations did. This is the wrong interpretation entirely. The choice is not about money, it is about identity. For boomers, the car communicated success to neighbors, to colleagues, to the self. The purchase was partly social. It told a story to an audience. But Gen Z came of age in an environment where the concept of performance, performing wealth, performing status, performing aspiration had been fundamentally destabilized. They watched influencers rent Lamborghinis for content. They watched finance gurus photograph private jets that weren't theirs. They developed, at a very young age, a finely calibrated detector for performance. And once that detector is built, it does not just evaluate others, it evaluates the self. Buying a luxury car to signal success would feel to many Gen Z individuals like becoming the thing they learned to see through. It would feel internally incoherent. The Honda Civic is not a compromise, it is a position. It is the choice that matches the internal framework they spent their entire adolescence constructing. There is also something specific happening with the concept of future self. Psychologists have studied how vividly people can imagine their future self, and how that vividness predicts financial behavior. People who can see their future self clearly tend to make better long-term financial decisions. They treat their future self like a real person whose interests matter now. Gen Z, shaped by years of financial content, by watching the consequences of debt unfold in real time across family and community, tends to have an unusually concrete relationship with the future version of themselves. The expensive car is not an upgrade to that future self, it is a drain on them, and that drain feels personal, not abstract. This is psychologically distinct from what previous generations experienced. Earlier consumer cultures were built around the present moment. Advertising was designed to suppress future self-thinking, to make the present desire feel overwhelming. Gen Z grew up partially immune to this mechanism, not because they are more virtuous, but because they were inoculated early by content that explicitly named the mechanism and explained how it worked.
There is also a social dimension that operates quietly beneath the surface. Gen Z's peer culture, particularly online, has developed new forms of status that have nothing to do with physical objects. The ability to explain a complex idea clearly, to build something independently, to have a skill that translates across contexts, these are the currencies that earn respect within Gen Z digital communities. A car cannot display these currencies. A car is a one-dimensional signal in a culture that has moved to multi-dimensional expression. The person who drives a Honda Civic and builds software, makes music, or solves problems is more legible and more respected in these spaces than someone who drives a luxury vehicle and contributes nothing to the conversation. None of this means Gen Z is uniformly anti-luxury or anti-aspiration. It means the shape of aspiration has changed. The things they want to spend on, experiences, tools that expand capability, financial independence, are not visible from the outside. And that invisibility is, for many of them, exactly the point. They are not performing for an audience. They have opted out of the performance entirely. Which brings everything back to that dealership floor. That 23-year-old walking past the future wall is not suppressing a desire for something better. He is acting in complete alignment with his values, his calculations, and his identity. He is not making a sacrifice, he is making a statement. Quietly, to no one in particular, in a language that requires no audience. The generation that grew up watching adults perform prosperity and then lose everything has decided that the performance itself was always the problem. The Honda Civic is not a consolation prize. It is proof that someone learned from watching.